Thank you and welcome to FCA International's September Safety Call. We welcome Mike Hartnett, a safety professional with Ameritrade, to take us through today's presentation. Mike, great seeing you, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. As John said, my name's Mike Hartnett, and today we'll be talking about safety contacts. How can we have valuable conversations that lead to change with our frontline? So that will be our topic for this September monthly safety call. As always, the FCA safety line is there. If you have any questions related to safety, go ahead and either call or email, and you will get responded to quickly with answers and advice. Right? So what we're talking about today are tools for successful employee conversations. We want to make sure that we understand how we go about getting behavior change, how we make sure that our front line understands what we need them to do. And the vast majority of those interactions are going to be performed by foremen. Foremen are the ones that are on the site day in and day out. When you talk to frontline employees, it is the foreman whose attitude really they believe is the company's attitude, right? So if your foreman is doing all the things you want them to and really building that engagement with your front line, then you really have an engaged front line. But if they're not, then you're not sure what you have. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about how we go about training our foreman currently. And then we'll talk about that supervisor skill set, right? Those skills that are so necessary that we need our foreman to know. Then we'll talk about the return on investment, okay? Because it costs a lot of money to do training, right? Not only do we have to pull people out of work, we have to pay them for the time that they're being trained, possibly paying for transportation as well. And then you have lack of production during those times. This can be very challenging for an organization. But if you put in the investment, you will get a return. And then, as usual, I'm going to try to share some resources with you so that you can go about enacting what we've talked about here. So the question is, how do we train our foreman? And I'd be willing to bet that if we talk to the vast majority of the people in this training, that it would be we give them a different color hard hat, right? It's a new color hard hat. Therefore, you're a foreman, so you should be able to do everything you need to. But do good tradesmen automatically make good foremen? Right? Those skill sets do not necessarily align. In fact, they're totally different skill sets. We need our supervisors to have a very specific set of skills. And the first one is really the skill that we bring them on for, right? The knowledge and skill at the trade is generally why we make somebody a foreman. Right? They're responsible and they really know what they're doing, right? And this is important. It's important that we have foremen that are good at the job, right? They know the skills, they know the trade, but it may not be the most important, right? How about motivation? How do our foremen motivate their crews? What skills do they use in that way? How have we built those skills, right? How to get engagement from their crews. Engaged workers really do put in the extra effort, right? When we have engaged workers, we get that discretionary effort that otherwise is left on the bench, right? How to promote safe behaviors. When we see safe behaviors out there in the field, what do we say? Well, generally, we don't say anything because safe behaviors is what you expect to see. That's what you want to see. But how do we make those happen more often? And how do we stop those unsafe behaviors? How do they train their apprentices? I know when I was an apprentice, it was pretty challenging. For the first few years there, I thought my name was, hey, you fat blank, so it makes it pretty challenging to take training in those type of situations. Right? How do they cover the toolbox talks? Right? We send toolbox talks out to our foremen and we ask them to share it with their crew, make sure that they go over this training. It's an important training. But how do our foremen perform that training? And how about that pre-job briefing? Beginning of the day, everybody's gathering. What do we talk about? How does that get done? Right? Are we just assigning tasks? Or are we talking about exposures? And how do we ensure that inspections are being performed? We have a lot of things that we're required to inspect before usage, right? If we're using bakers or mini bakers, those are scaffold. They require a daily inspection by a competent person. So your frontline employees should be performing those inspections daily. How do we make sure that they happen? Right? And how do we investigate incidents? So if these are the important skills that a supervisor must have, how many of them are you training your supervisors in? These are not natural to most people. Right? Maybe there are, of course, some natural leaders out there, those who through experience or birth just really come naturally to some of these skill sets, right? But the majority of our people out in the field do not. We want to make sure that they optimize these skills so that you can get the most out of your crews. Next, we look at hazard identification. One of the key things we need our foreman to do is to be able to predict what's going to happen, right? To see the hazards, to see the exposures prior to them happening, right? Looking at the other trades and the scheduling of the work, make sure we're not in this area at the same time that the roofing work is being done, or when they are setting HVAC equipment with a crane up on the roof, making sure that we aren't in that area, right? We want to make sure our foremen understand what raises risk, what increases the likelihood of an incident, and also what causes significant injuries and fatalities. SIF, it's a really hot term right now about those incidents that really lead to life-changing impacts, right? Well, it's important that we train our supervisors how to do that. Train our foremen how to look at the world, look at their job. Now, most of you, if we were to ask what training do we provide our foremen, most common response I get in construction is that, we gave them an OSHA 30, right? And OSHA 30 has value, right? What does it teach? Compliance. Making sure that we follow all of the rules, right? A knowledge of what regulations are important to you. And also OSHA's role and how to contact them, how to get them to come out on site and do inspections. There's a lot of information covered by the OSHA 30. I am an outreach trainer for OSHA. I think it's a really good program. And there is a little bit of range for what we can train in the OSHA 30, right? That has to do with how we get behavior change. You can get about an hour in there, but you have to request it, right? OSHA 30 has electives within it, and a trainer gets to choose what where you're going to be covered. So you can make sure that your OSHA 30 trainer is going ahead and specializing it towards your trade, to your exposures, and also make sure that they take the allotted time that's available to talk about leadership and behavior change and accountability and how we get those in the field. Right. So there's not a large section of that OSHA 30 that can do it. There's about a 2-hour section that you can use an elective towards that. Right. So it does have benefits in there. Right. But it also teaches to the level of compliance. Now, a lot of general contractors are going to require it. Right. I've been in that situation before where a GC requires an OSHA 30 to have been formed in the last few, however many years. Another benefit of the OSHA 30 is often the union hall is going to provide that to their employees. And it's a pretty staple training that you can get in the hall, and that would help eliminate some of your exposure to the cost for doing it. Right? OSHA 30s never really expire. But at the same time, most general contractors have a time frame with which they require that OSHA 30. So there are a lot of benefits for it, but what does OSHA not teach? Right? They don't really teach those skill sets that we talked about earlier. They don't talk about behavior change. They talk about what things we need to make sure are done in what way. But it doesn't tell us how to get people that have been doing it one way for 15, 20, 30 years to change the way they're doing it. Right? How to use disciplinary action. Disciplinary action is key to supervision. Right? It is extremely important if OSHA comes to do an inspection on your company. Because if you do not have disciplinary records, that shows that you are not enforcing safety, right, as far as they're concerned. So we need to make sure that we teach our foreman when disciplinary action is required, when it should be used. And it should not be used to the point where everything's okay until you're fired, right? If we use it as a stick to help build that behavior change, it can really be a valuable tool. But if we only use it when we're trying to get rid of somebody, then we have issues, right? So keeping those records can be challenging, and using discipline can be challenging when we're dealing with a union environment. That's very clear and very true. So we want to make sure that we are following our collective bargaining agreement as far as that goes. But you need to record your disciplinary actions, whether that is verbal or written warnings, right? And then how to build leadership skills. Like I said, you can get a 2-hour elective within the OSHA 30 if you ask your trainer to put it in there about leadership skills. But largely, if you go to the hall, they're not going to have that as built-in part of it most of the time. Right? So you want to make sure you ask for those specifics if you're going to use the OSHA 30. Personally, I do not think that the OSHA 30 by itself does what we need to do for our foreman. Right? It does tell them about a lot of regulations, often more regulations than they can consume in the amount of time that the class takes. 4 days of sitting in that classroom can be very challenging, especially 4 days in a row for tradesmen, right? The classroom is not where we thrive. So the OSHA 30 has its place. It's a valuable training, but does it really do what we need for our supervisors? One of the things we need to make sure our supervisors are doing are leading, right? We need leaders out in the front line. And we need to make sure that our leaders out in the front line are leading in a way that works for younger workers. Ask yourself, what is the average age of your journeyman? Imagine that number is a bit higher than you're comfortable with right now. If we want to keep young workers in the trades, we need to make sure we use a management style that doesn't drive them away. Okay, so we have authoritarian versus engagement. Most of us, when we become foremen, what do we have as experience? Well, the foremen that we've seen work with us, right? That would mean to me a lot of yelling, right? I had foremen that were in different areas. Most of them were coercive, right? Do what I tell you to. Look, I'm not paying you to think, I'm paying you to work. Right? And that worked pretty well in the 90s and aughts. Right? With that generation, we kind of expected it. Right? But it does not work with the younger generation. And it's one of the reasons we're having such challenges keeping young workers in the trades. Leadership style is extremely important. And we need to make sure that we help to train our foremen in a leadership style that works for the workers that we have in the field, for the workers that we want to have in the field. Right? If we have an authoritarian type leader, you're not going to get the reporting that you normally get. Right? You're also not going to get that discretionary effort. You may get some discretionary effort hoping that somebody doesn't get yelled at, right? But it's really not the same quality as what you're looking for. And is the communication going both ways, right? If your front line isn't telling your foreman things, then you have a communication problem. Okay, it's going to make sure that problems you have, issues that are there, will bite you in the rear, as opposed to near miss reporting, learning what's going on in the field, frontline employees sharing their concerns about what they see so that we can get solutions to them and correct them in the field. Leadership style is extremely important. And really, it comes down to two different types of leadership, right? As a foreman, you have two different roles, right? One of the roles is tasks, right? You need to make sure everything gets done, the quality is there, the scheduling is where you need it to, what person is put in what job, right? Matching skill levels to challenges. And that is the left side of this balance scale, right? The tasks. It's very important. It's very important that they have a good management style as far as that goes, or management skill set. But the other half is relationships, right? Relationships is the part of leadership that is often left alone when we don't train our foremen on leadership. And the difference here between tasks and relationship is the difference in what you get from your frontline employees. Because if you have a foreman who's very good at the task side, right, people can follow them. But if you have a foreman that is good at the relationship side, they will follow, right? And you will get that better outcome. You get that more efficient work. So behavior change. Behavior change is a skill set every foreman needs to know. And if you go out and you see your foreman and they're out there coaching their people, right? If they're out there coaching instead of just yelling. Now, I've been coached where I've been yelled at, and sometimes that's a part of that coaching, but never by itself, right? So if we are using coaching, if you see your frontline foreman coaching, then you may have some of that behavior change in place already. The strategies that we're going to utilize to try to build that coaching is accountability, right? We make sure we define what our expectations are, and then we evaluate those outcomes, and we provide reward or discipline, right? Reward isn't always money, and discipline isn't always a write-up. There's many different levels of this, right? A reward can be good job. A discipline could be, you can do better than that, right? These are very important ways to really build that behavior change. We need to make sure our foremen are looking for specific things, because what management pays attention to, what your foreman pays attention to, is what your frontline employee thinks is important. So how many times a day do you think your foremen are talking about output, production, versus how many times they're talking about safety? And if we're talking about production 3 or 4 times more often than we're talking about safety, what's the most important thing to the foreman and expands the company? Money, right? That production is what matters. We talk about safety, but we really talk about production. So what management pays attention to is what's important to the company, whether it is important to the company or not. So what management ignores, what foremen do not correct, they condone. So when you have frontline employees not wearing their PPE and the foreman's walking by and not saying anything about it, that's because he's condoning there's no PPE, right? They're condoning those unsafe behaviors. So we really need to make sure they know that they're aware of what impact they have. And then how is management measured? Right? We need to have accountability at the foreman level to get accountability at the frontline level. When teams see that their leaders are accountable and held accountable, they become more accountable themselves. So tactics are one of the ways we also need to train our employees, right? Our foremen need to know tactics for how to get behavior change. And, one example of that is the SBI or the SBI Plus success model, right? Coaching for Success model is the name of this one. I did not create it, but I have taught it quite a few times and used it. It's very effective, right? And I'll break it down pretty simply. It goes like this. When you're going to do positive reinforcement, right? We want a behavior to happen again. Then we use the SBI technique, and that is situation, behavior, impact, right? First, we're very specific about what behavior we want to repeat. If we're not specific about what behavior we want repeated, then we may not know what we're reinforcing. So I saw when you were setting up that ladder, there's a situation. Then you talk about the behavior that you specifically want repeated. I saw that you made sure that the ladder was at the right angle by putting your feet at the feet and sticking your arms out to make sure it had that 4-to-1 ratio. And then the impact. And doing that makes it so that it's not going to kick out on you. It's not going to fall back. And it really makes it so that we can get this job done without any injuries. Now, that is how we use coaching, right? That's one example of how we use the SBI. Now, it doesn't work in one instance, right? We need to utilize it multiple times. We need to utilize it as part of our communication with the front line. So training our foremen on how to do that, how to reinforce positive behaviors is important. And how do we get unsafe behaviors to stop? Corrective feedback. And it works largely the same way. You start with the situation, behavior, and the impact, right? Hey, I saw when you were setting up that ladder that instead of, checking to make sure is at that right angle. You just put it up and started climbing. And what could have been the impact of that? Open-ended questions are really important, right? So we ask open-ended questions. Let the frontline employee tell you what they did wrong. And if they don't know, then we can tell them. Then we ask what behavior they could have done differently that would have avoided the issue, and let them come up with that solution, because an employee is much more likely to follow their solution than yours, right? So by offering up them to tell you what would be a good way to avoid it, you get an answer for what this employee will do to avoid that. And then what's the alternate impact? Asking those questions, opening that conversation so that there's a two-way discussion going on is extremely important to get that engagement from your front line and to get the behavior change for your foreman. Too many times I've talked to foremen and they're just like, this job is just babysitting. It can be, right? But it doesn't have to be. If we train our foremen how to effectively get behavior change, it then becomes something that they enjoy more, right? When they start seeing this work, you really do get better enjoyment from that role, right? Being able to impact and change what's being done so it's done the right way really helps to build that pride in work, pride in company, pride in crew. And these are things that are really important to us to really get the quality and production and safety that we need from our crews. So a couple other things that foremen do are the pre-job briefing and the toolbox talks. So when we're talking about that daily kickoff, everybody gathers around. Bill, I'm going to have you painting frames today. William, I need you to be prepping ahead of Bill so that we have everything done and set up. Make sure you do the sweeping. Reggie, I want you to come over here, make sure that you clean up the shop, get everything in order. That is often what a pre-job briefing is. And it's valuable, making sure everybody knows what they're doing, and it's necessary. But it can also be used to think about what the exposures are with each job, right? So instead of saying, Bill, you're going to be spraying frames, we can say, Bill, you're going to be spraying frames. What are you going to do as far as PPE to protect yourself from that material? Asking questions, open-ended questions that can't be answered with a yes or no, gets your crews communicating and having conversations. Okay? And this communication and conversation has everything to do with employee satisfaction. It really is impactful, right? Plus, it gets them thinking, and perhaps even across conversation from different people, a discussion of what the hazards are, what the exposures are, and how we're going to protect from them. And how about toolbox talks? I know when I first started seeing toolbox talks come to the job site, I'd read them when they got passed to me. And I was probably one of the only people on many of the crews that did read them. And I'd get a stink eye from a foreman, but they never stopped me from reading what was on there before I signed it. But are they really being used? Are they of a value? Right? Because if it's just getting passed around and signed, it's not going to do very well. And if the foreman is just standing there reading through it, it's not going to be very effective either. Your frontline employees are not going to be thinking about what the foreman's talking about. We know he's not going to ask any questions. We already know everything we need to know about ladders, so why even listen to this? They'll be thinking about what they're going to be doing after work or how they're going to get the work done today, which are important, but that's not why we're using toolbox talks, right? It's an important part of that conversation. Once again, conversation is a word that comes up a lot. So are they being discussed? We can train our foremen how to utilize those toolbox talks in a way that gets their employees involved with it, right? We can combine it with our pre-job briefing and make sure that we're asking for specific examples of what other people have seen or the foreman has seen related to this hazard. Asking for other members of the crew to be part of this conversation is really when we have that dynamic change, really where we get that engagement, and our frontline employees really start to begin that their opinion is important and their knowledge is important, not just their skills are important. Right. So we want to make sure that they are not just checking the box when it comes to pre-job briefings and toolbox talks. We want to make sure that they are going in depth. So when something does go wrong, we have incident investigations. Right? So who do you have on site to perform this investigation? Some companies will send out a safety manager to go perform that. And, that can work well, but depends how long it takes them to get to the site, right? How many of the witnesses have already talked about amongst themselves what happened and gotten that conversation? This can lead to some misinformation and losing some evidence that might have been there in the first place. So having your foreman trained on how to investigate incidents is important. And we can't expect them to know how to do an incident investigation by just giving them an incident report form. If we give them that form and they fill it out, what are you going to find as your root causes? Right? Employee error, employee distraction, bad luck. We need to make sure that they understand what leads to incidents so that we can prevent it. Right? Not only does this help make them better at predicting and talking about those exposures with frontline employees, but it really makes sure that you get the outcome you need from incident investigations, that you learn the lessons you needed to learn to prevent this type of injury happening again. And letting them understand how to perform interviews or how to take pictures, right? Even if we're not talking about interviews, just handing out form for the employee that tells you what they saw, right? Witness statements. We need to make sure that we train our foreman on how to do this. That way, even if they aren't the one performing the actual investigation, they can do those time-critical tasks that really pay dividends when the safety manager or coordinator, whoever it is that does those investigations, does arrive on site. So, is there a return on investment for training your foreman? We know there's a lot of costs involved with training foremen, and that's a real challenge. I understand it, and having that investment upfront can be a problem. But we want to make sure that we get the benefits, right? And from your foreman, you get accountability, increased reporting, effectiveness, and satisfaction. These last two are hugely important, right? When a foreman becomes more effective at getting behavior change, because nothing is more frustrating than telling somebody to do something different again and again and again and getting no change, right? Any of you that have been a foreman in the field, or I'm sure you have direct reports now, that repeat and not getting any behavior change is very frustrating and leads to unhappiness with your job. However, if you get effective at that coaching, if you learn to use that skill, then that satisfaction that the foreman gets really does pay dividends, makes them happier at work. And that's really important. I know we can't make our employees be happy at work, but it's important that we try to make our employees happy as we can. Remove those barriers to happiness, because a happy worker is a productive worker. How about your front line? Your frontline employees are going to be more engaged. Your retention will go up, right? What if every apprentice that started with you kept on working with you, right? All the good ones, all those that were coachable. If you were able to keep all of those apprentices and never lose any, you'd be in a very good position, right? Maybe some of you are in that position now, and that's great. But training our foremen will really help with that retention. Right? Increasing reporting is really important, and improved climate. Right? If we can improve the climate of our crews, if we can make our company good to work in, it's going to be a company that all the tradesmen want to be in. And that's really going to help our talent level within the organization. So when you consider the cost of injuries, how many injuries do you have to prevent to pay for the requirements to do some training for your foreman, right? One medical consulted injury is about $42,000. That's what the National Safety Council says. $42,000 will pay for a lot of training. Right? So if you prevent one incident, and arguably putting all of your foremen through this training will prevent one incident. Can't guarantee it, but it's a pretty good bet, let alone the cost of a significant injury fatality, right? Which none of us want, and hopefully none of us have to deal with. All right, so let's talk about some resources. How do we get this training for our foreman? Well, there's multiple different ways we can do it, right? CPWR, it's no longer the Center for Protection of Workers' Rights. I forget what their name is, something to do with construction workers' safety. But CPWR, they have a course, Foundations of Safety Leadership. It's authorized to be part of the OSHA 30, so you can request it from your OSHA 30 provider, right, to be part of that course. It's a free course. It's they provide, anybody can use that, right? So either you can utilize it to train it yourself. You do not have to be part of that OSHA 30, right? If we wanted to bring in all of our foremen quarterly and do a 2.5-hour training, this could be a really good topic for it, right? And this is a free training that's available to anyone. There's your link. There's also regional dependent resources. So if you're in Ontario, there's a 1-hour free supervisor training from Construction Ontario. Oregon Healthy Workforce Center has a supervisor training program. There's a lot of different programs in different areas, so make sure you look at what is being offered in your area. I did reach out to both international and a local district council to see what kind of resources were being were available there, but I was unable to get any calls back. Even told them I was a member of IUPAT for 15 years, still no calls. Last but not least, AmeriSafe. We have a lot of offerings related to this. This is one of the key roles I have as a safety consultant, is training in frontline supervision, leadership training, really how to build that skill set. So we have a 16-hour customizable 4 days, 4 hours each, fundamentals of safety for supervisors. And then we have a series of 5 workshops that are 5 hours each one covering one of the topics that we've talked about earlier today. Including, it's a workshop that's interactive so that we get that practice trying it. So there are other options out there as well. Right? The options I offered up here are not the only options by any means. So look into the options available in your area. Some of them are going to be available on site. Some of them are going to be available remote, digitally. I know that we've, over the COVID, have really expanded our online training, right? Our capability for online training has really changed because we're forced to. So even if you looked at this a few years ago, you might find that you have different options today than you did then. So please go ahead and take a look at that. If you have any questions, the safety helpline is a member benefit. If you have a safety question and either call or email, it generally ends up going across my desk, and I try to get back to FCA membership as soon as possible.